Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to all of our guests. I wanted to direct my first round of questions to Ms. Finlay. During our last week's session, we had some debate and discussion about whether or not hyperlinks should or should not be part of the bill, whether or not reproducing a headline or the lead of a story constituted a substantive part. And I wondered if you could just explain to us the copyright law around the sharing of links and around fair use and what constitutes fair use under Canadian law.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Simons. Hyperlinks, there has been some case law about hyperlinks and whether that triggers the reproduction right. And so far, the couple of cases we have found that hyperlinks do not trigger a copyright. I'm not going to say it's settled law because these things have not moved all the way up through all levels of court, but that is sort of the status of the law today on hyperlinks. Headlines, also a bit of a question mark. The fundamental sort of the basis of copyright is that it protects the entirety of a work or substantial part of a work. So a headline, depending on how much or how, let me back up a second. Substantial part is assessed in two ways, quantitatively as well as qualitatively. So it's not just I took 5 seconds of a song or I took 3 sentences of a 40-page article. It's also how important is the part taken to the work as a whole. So if you take the very heart of the work, that even if it's only 1 sentence out of a 40-page article, that could still constitute a substantial part and would be protected by copyright. Fair dealing is a constant discussion. In Canada, it's fair dealing is the exception, not fair use. And it's also not just an exception, but it is a user's right in Canada, according to the Supreme Court of Canada. So we are constantly balancing out the copyright owner's rights with the rights of users. Fair dealing is always contextual and always depends on the circumstance of the case. So I can't tell you for certain whether a paragraph will or will not be fair dealing. There's a number of factors that a court would consider, but it's always a question, and it's always in play when we're talking about reproduction of literary works and other works.
Because I think this was the concern that I had, is that if S-225 doesn't include hyperlinks, as it does not as currently written, it's hard for me to imagine what works are being shared. If it does include hyperlinks, I think you get into a fair dealing issue and a question of whether hyperlinks do constitute republication. And so I couldn't quite see where the revenues would accrue to anyone, because I couldn't understand, at what point would royalty use be engaged?
Well, even with the use of a hyperlink, if we think that's the only thing that happens, there are reproductions that happen on the servers of the platforms. So there are certainly arguments that entire works are being reproduced. There are entire databases of content that are being created. They're all very good questions, and they're technical questions in terms of what would be triggered, what wouldn't. I would be cautious of excluding hyperlinks in a bill like this. As I mentioned already this evening, I'm not supportive of the bill overall because I don't think it actually adds anything. It certainly, if anything, it takes away from the rights that journalists and news media publishers already have. But if the bill were to move forward, I would be hesitant to exclude hyperlinks at this point because it is unsettled. I think there'd be a lot of discussion about whether hyperlinks ought to be paid for and the reproductions that happen behind the scenes or up front as well. So I would, like I said, if we're going to move forward with the bill, I wouldn't prejudge the situation by excluding hyperlinks.
For this round.
All right, this is a question from Mr. Greenspon. You spoke, I thought, quite importantly about the danger of being so much more dependent on big platforms as business partners, to come to them sort of cap in hand and make Canadian publishers that much more vulnerable to their pressures. But is there not an equal danger simply in a system that was a sort of a more transparent tax system, that you have just made news organizations that much more dependent on those platforms whose algorithms curate what we see and decide what is news and what is not news? I just worry that any kind of vassal serf, lord relationship with the big platforms leaves us uniquely vulnerable.
Senator Simons, I just want to clarify. I thought where you were going was isn't even more dangerous to be dependent on government. That's where I thought you were going, but that's not where you went.
That too. I mean, as you know, because you and I have talked about this, it makes journalists itchy to get money from government, and for government to define who is a journalist and who is not, and who is worthy and who is not. That's a separate argument. The argument I'm really concerned about is the parasitic argument. If the only future for Canadian journalism is to come cap in hand to the big platforms to ask for handouts in one way or another, then haven't we lost a unique kind of independent voice? I mean, it's one thing to be owned by an American hedge fund. It's another thing to be wholly dependent on Google or Apple or Facebook for your very existence.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the world in which we sort of grew up in journalism was a world in which you had hundreds of sources of revenue. And so if people say, when I was editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, or when I was a local reporter in Lloydminster on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border, did I come under pressure from an advertiser? Yes, I did. It was very, very, very rare and infrequent occurrence, but it ever happened, yes. And because that advertiser was worth 0.5% of your revenues or something, it was pretty easy to say, and for your publisher to back you in saying that. If it's 10% of your revenue, if it's actually obscure how much of the revenue it is that's coming from a single source, it's a powerful player in society, that's problematic. That is poor governance. We don't even know then who owns the press. He who pays the piper. So who pays the piper? The better part, the thing that makes government a little bit better but bad, is that I think in government you can impose mechanisms to keep at arm's length, to stay away, to have formulas, to have them be transparent, to have the press hounding the government constantly about this, and that keeps people a bit more honest. So these are both bad solutions. I want to be clear about that. Which is less bad.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Key, I note that it's not that long ago that Google made a deal with a group of French publishers, a syndicate of French news organizations, for a kind of I don't want to call it profit sharing, but for a financial arrangement. But I also noted with interest that those news publishers belonged to a consortium where they were sort of validated and approved by an organization as legitimate news organizations. And this was a subject that came up in our previous questions, where some of our witnesses talked about the need to establish what's an official Canadian journalist. As somebody who spent 30 years as a Canadian journalist, that makes me twitch. So I wanted to ask each of you, both Mr. Ingram and Mr. Key, I guess for Mr. Key, first of all, if you can explain the French deal and the model, and then for Mr. Ingram, what concerns you might have about the idea of a government body deciding who is or isn't a legitimate journalist and worthy of financial support.
Certainly. So, and this actually goes very much to the copyright approach. So in Europe, they introduced through the European Copyright Directive this new Article 13 that basically was going to require Google to engage in the negotiation and provision of royalties for the use of certain types of news content. Now, it's very important to note, even in the European model, it excluded hyperlinks, it excluded what we call short extracts, snippets, but there is an ongoing debate, which is still ongoing, about what exactly is a short snippet because it was not defined in the legislation. France was the first country to transpose that directive into national law, and that then generated a ongoing conversation that we've had with a number of effectively collective societies within France around what the scope of that would look like. We come to settlements with primarily the APIG, which is the primarily press publisher in France, mostly so they would recognize that Google News Showcase, which we're currently negotiating in Canada, would also be acceptable as a equivalent resolution to this issue in France. There's been a few questions that have arisen around that of late with respect to other societies, and so we're currently working through those processes. But it's basically working through collectives because French law requires it in a way that Canadian law does not. And so that's the main difference. But as I highlighted, and as others of us have highlighted, the Canadian copyright system is not as amenable to this approach as a matter of royalties as the European civilian system is. And so generally speaking, we tend to favor alternative approaches. It's why we've actually come to the table with the showcase negotiations without any legislative hammer being held over our head, because we actually want to secure these arrangements and these deals without necessarily having to pursue a regulatory solution. And I'll leave it to Mr. Ingram, who can probably speak to how journalists might respond to this.
Yes, thank you, Senator Simons. I would just say that I share your concerns about any system that purports to define what is a quality journalistic organization, what is a quality journalist, what is to choose effectively what qualifies as journalism and what doesn't, because I don't think that's a great road to go down. I think you can wind up in one case you would wind up choosing all the things that we have all heard of, all the entities that we know of, the large ones, the established ones. And to be honest, I'm not convinced that that's where the future of journalism lies. I might pick a completely different list of organizations, but if I wasn't the one choosing, then they would be left out. And I think it's whenever you draw that circle too tightly and leave organizations out, you run a risk of missing something important.